Hey guys, tonight we follow the smallest footsteps into the darkest forests. In the old Slavic world, children were warned never to stray from the path because something ancient was waiting, something without mercy. They called them forest spirits, and when a child vanished, the village didn't blame wolves, they blamed the woods. But a few children came back, and what they remembered was worse than any bedtime story. But before we begin, if you enjoy quiet, dark stories from the past, feel free to support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? I read every comment. It's always wild to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now take a breath and settle in. This is Myth Night, where you relax and I tell you true stories from the forgotten past. And if you fall asleep before the end, that's okay. Some stories were made to be finished in dreams, in the forgotten woods of old Slavic lands, where birch trees whispered secrets to the wind and shadows moved with purposes older than memory. Children learned to walk carefully. Every footstep mattered. Every breath could be their last if they forgot the rules their grandmothers had carved into their hearts with stories told by dying firelight. The forest was not empty. It never had been. Long before churches rose in village squares, before princes claimed dominion over rivers and valleys, the woods belonged to others. Ancient beings who remembered when the world was young, when humans were few and respectful, when every tree had a name, and every stream carried the voices of those who had drowned in its depths. These were not the gentle woodland creatures of children's tales told in safe, warm houses. These were the old ones, the hungry ones, the spirits who had watched empires rise and fall while they remained unchanged, patient, waiting in the spaces between what mortals called real and what they feared was true. Picture a child, perhaps 8 years old, perhaps younger, standing at the edge of a village where the last wooden fence post marked the boundary between safety and the unknown. Beyond that post, the forest stretched endlessly, dark green and deep brown, alive with sounds that had no names in human tongues. The child's mother had died in childbirth. Her father worked in distant fields. Only her grandmother remained to teach her the old ways, the true ways, the ways that kept children alive when night fell and the spirits stirred. "Listen, little dove," the grandmother would whisper, her voice like dry leaves rustling in autumn wind. "The forest sees everything. It hears everything, and it remembers those who show disrespect." The child would nod, wide eyes reflecting the dancing flames, small hands clutching a wooden doll carved from rowan wood, the first protection, though not the last she would need. "There are rules," grandmother continued, her gnarled fingers working knots into a cord of braided grass. "Break them, and you feed the hungry dark. Follow them, and you might see another dawn." The rules seemed simple when spoken aloud, in the warm safety of the cottage. But in the forest, where every shadow could hide watching eyes, and every sound might be the last thing a child ever heard, simplicity became the thin line between survival and disappearance. The first rule was silence about the one who walked on root legs through the deepest woods. Never speak his name aloud among the trees. Never call to him, even in jest. Never answer if you hear your own voice calling from empty clearings where no one stands. For the Leshy was always listening, always watching, always ready to lead curious children so far from home that their bones would rest forever beneath carpets of pine needles and moss. Young Yana learned this rule when she was 7. During the summer, her father sent her to gather cloudberries in the forest's edge. The berries grew thick and sweet near the old oak that marked the boundary between the safe woods where village children had played for generations and the deep forest where grandmother said the real dangers lived. But cloudberries were precious. They could be preserved through winter, traded for salt and iron, used to heal fevers that claimed children too young to fight them off. So despite her fear, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, Yana filled her woven basket and ventured deeper among the trees. The forest seemed to breathe around her. Ancient oaks creaked in windless air. Pine boughs whispered secrets she almost understood. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker's drumming echoed like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. Yana picked her berries quickly, efficiently, the way grandmother had taught her, never taking all from one bush, always leaving offerings of breadcrumbs for the forest's smaller creatures, always keeping the village smoke visible through the branches. But then she heard it, her own voice, calling from somewhere deeper in the woods. Clear as spring water, familiar as her reflection, unmistakably her own voice, singing the lullaby grandmother hummed while cooking dinner. Sleep, little dove, sleep through the night. Morning will come with the first warm light. Safe in your bed, safe in my care. Nothing can harm you, nothing can scare. Yana froze, cloudberries spilling from her suddenly numb fingers. The voice continued singing, moving slowly through the trees, always just out of sight, but growing clearer, more enticing. It sang of home, of warm milk and honey cakes, of grandmother's gentle hands braiding her hair by firelight. But grandmother had warned her about this, about the voice that sounded like your own, that sang your secret songs, that promised everything your heart desired if you would only follow it deeper into the green darkness where the sun never touched the ground. This was his trick, the forest guardian's most beloved deception. He could mirror any voice, any face, any memory that might draw a child away from safety. He could become your mother, calling for you to come home, your father promising sweet gifts if you would just step off the path, your own voice singing the songs that brought you comfort in dark hours. Yana remembered grandmother's instructions as clearly as if the old woman stood beside her. Without looking toward the singing voice, never look, never acknowledge, never let curiosity overcome wisdom, she reached into her small leather pouch and pulled out a crust of black bread. Her fingers shook as she broke it into 7 pieces and scattered them among the roots of the nearest birch tree. For you, Grandfather Forest, she whispered, using the respectful term grandmother had taught her. I mean no harm. I take only what I need. I ask safe passage home. The singing stopped. The forest held its breath. No birds called. No insects buzzed. Even the wind died away until Yana could hear only her own terrified heartbeat and the distant sound of village dogs barking. Normal sounds, human sounds, sounds that meant safety still existed somewhere in the world. Then she heard footsteps, not the light step of a child or the familiar tread of a villager. These footsteps crushed the forest floor with weight that spoke of something vast moving among the trees. Something that walked on legs thick as tree trunks, something that breathed with the deep rhythm of caves and stone. But Yana remembered the second protection grandmother had taught her. Moving slowly, careful not to show fear or haste, she removed her woolen vest and turned it inside out, then put it back on with the seams facing the world. She untied her shoes and placed them on the wrong feet. Left shoe on right foot, right shoe on left foot. She pulled the wooden comb from her hair and turned it backwards, teeth facing her scalp instead of away. Everything reversed, everything confused. For the Leshy, powerful as he was, became lost in contradictions. He who could lead travelers in endless circles until they died of thirst and exhaustion could himself be confused by simple reversals, by the human trick of becoming temporarily backwards in a world he expected to follow natural order. The footsteps circled her hiding place 3 times, each circuit closer than the last. Branches snapped under immense weight. The ground trembled with each step. Once, a shadow fell across the berry bush where she crouched, a shadow too large and wrongly shaped to belong to any creature she knew. But the footsteps never stopped moving, never found her exact location, never closed in for the final approach that would have meant the end of her short life. Eventually, the sounds faded. The forest released its held breath. Birds began to call again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Yana waited until the sun had moved 3 fingers' width across the sky before she dared to move. Then, still wearing her reversed clothing, still placing her wrongly shod feet carefully on ground that might yet conceal watching eyes, she walked home. She told no one what had happened. That was another rule. Speak of encounters with the forest spirits to your family only, and only when the moon was dark and the doors were locked and salt had been scattered across the threshold. To speak carelessly of such things was to invite them closer, to let them know you had seen their true faces and might see them again. But grandmother knew. She always knew. When Yana arrived home, with her clothing rumpled and backwards, with pine needles in her hair and the pale, hollow look of a child who had glimpsed something beyond human understanding, grandmother simply nodded and prepared the evening meal without questions. Later, when the fire burned low and shadows danced on the cottage walls, grandmother added another charm to the cord of braided grass that hung above Yana's sleeping place. She whispered protective words in the old language, the tongue their grandmothers had spoken before the coming of new gods and new ways. And she told Yana of other children, in other times, who had met the forest guardian and lived to remember. Some forgot to turn their clothes, grandmother murmured. Some looked when they heard their names called. Some followed the beautiful music that promised them everything their hearts desired. Those children became part of the forest forever. They feed the birds with their laughter and water the trees with their tears, but they never come home. Yana shivered and pulled her blanket closer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and howling around the cottage eaves like something huge and hungry, testing for weakness, for any gap that might let it inside. But some children remembered, grandmother continued. Some kept the old ways alive in their hearts. Some learned that survival comes not from courage or strength, but from respect and wisdom and the knowledge that we are small things in a vast world that does not always wish us well. The dangers of the forest were not limited to the deep woods where ancient trees grew thick as fortress walls. Even the edges of human settlement, where streams ran clear and villagers drew water for cooking and washing, held their own terrors for children who forgot to show proper respect. The Rusalka knew when children approached the water alone. These were not the gentle spirits of later tales, not the romantic figures who would brush your hair if you asked politely. These were the drowned ones, the women and girls who had died in water and remained trapped between the world of the living and the country of the dead. They remembered the weight of water in their lungs, the darkness of sinking beneath surfaces that reflected sky they would never see again, and they were hungry for company in their cold, wet realm beneath the waves. Milka learned about the water spirits on a morning when spring floods had swollen the river that ran past her village. The miller's wheel turned frantically in the rushing current, grinding grain with unusual speed, while the adults worried about whether the waters would rise high enough to flood the houses closest to the bank. But for a 10-year-old girl whose daily chores included fetching water for cooking and washing, the high river meant a shorter walk to fill her clay jugs. Instead of the usual trek to the deep pool where village women gathered to gossip while they worked, Milka could draw water from the small inlet where the river curved close to the grain fields. Her mother had warned her about going to the water alone, especially during flood times when the spirits were said to be strongest. But Milka was practical and impatient, tired of waiting for her older cousins to finish their own morning tasks. The jugs needed filling. The day was young. What harm could come from a quick trip to the riverside? She gathered her water vessels, 2 clay jugs, and a leather bucket, and walked the muddy path toward the swollen stream. The morning mist still clung to the water's surface, creating strange shapes that seemed to move with their own purpose. Fish jumped in the fast current, their silver bodies flashing like signals sent between worlds. Somewhere upstream, a beaver slapped its tail against the water with a sound like a giant's hand striking flesh. Milka knelt at the water's edge and dipped her first jug beneath the surface. The river was shockingly cold, despite the spring warmth, and her hands quickly grew numb as she worked. The current was stronger than she had expected, tugging at the clay vessel with surprising force, as if something beneath the surface wanted to pull it, and perhaps her, into the rushing depths. That was when she heard the singing, not human singing, though it began that way. A woman's voice, clear and sweet, drifting across the water from somewhere upstream where the mist hung thickest. The song was in the old language, the words strange but somehow familiar, as if Milka had heard them before, in dreams she couldn't quite remember. The voice was singing about water, about the peace that came to those who let the current carry them away, about the beautiful gardens that grew beneath the river's surface, where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names and fruit grew sweet without need of sunlight. It spoke of sisters waiting below, sisters who had found perfect happiness in the green depths where time moved differently and pain was only a memory from the harsh world above. Milka found herself moving closer to the water's edge, her water jugs forgotten in the mud. The song was so beautiful, so full of promise and comfort. It spoke to the part of her that was tired of daily chores, tired of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier each year, tired of being a child in a world that demanded she be useful but not curious, obedient but not questioning. The water looked inviting now, welcoming. The mist parted to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. Not the muddy bottom she expected, but gardens of water plants that swayed like dancing girls, schools of fish that swam in perfect formations like living jewelry, and deeper down, half hidden in the green shadows, pale figures with long flowing hair who beckoned with graceful hands. One of the figures looked exactly like Milka's sister Anna, who had drowned 3 years ago when ice broke beneath her feet during the winter fishing. Anna smiled and held out her arms, her mouth moving in words Milka couldn't hear but somehow understood. Come play with us. Come dance with us. Come home to the place where children never grow old and never have to work and never have to cry. Milka's feet moved without her conscious decision. One step toward the water, then another. The mud sucked at her shoes, but she barely noticed. The singing grew louder, more complex, as if dozens of voices had joined the first. They sang of freedom from hunger, from cold, from the endless succession of days that began with labor and ended with exhaustion. They sang of eternal play in gardens beneath the waves. But just as the water touched her toes, just as she prepared to take the final step that would carry her into the river's embrace. A sharp pain bit into her ankle. She looked down and saw a small red ant clinging to her leg, its mandibles buried in her flesh. The pain was minor but sudden, breaking the song's hypnotic spell like a stone thrown through glass. Milka stumbled backward, suddenly aware of where she stood and what she had almost done. Her grandmother's warnings flooded back like cold water. Never go to the river alone during flood season. Never listen to beautiful singing that comes from empty water. Never trust visions of dead relatives calling from beneath the surface. And always, always carry iron when near the water spirit's realm. Milka reached into her apron pocket and found the iron nail her grandmother had given her, wrapped in cloth and blessed with protective words. The moment her fingers closed around the metal, the singing stopped, the mist cleared, the water resumed its normal muddy brown color, revealing only rocks and silt and the occasional fish where moments before she had seen underwater gardens and dancing figures. She backed away from the river's edge, her heart hammering so hard she felt sick. The ant had disappeared, if it had ever been an ant at all. Some said the household spirits, the small protective beings who watched over families, could take insect form when they needed to wake children from dangerous dreams. Milka filled her water jugs quickly, efficiently, never taking her eyes off the innocent-looking stream that had nearly claimed her life. She spoke the protection words grandmother had taught her. I take only what I need. I give thanks for the gift. I respect the boundary between your realm and mine. Then she hurried home, the iron nail clutched in her fist, the weight of the water jugs nothing compared to the weight of understanding how close she had come to disappearing forever. Her grandmother was waiting when she returned, standing in the doorway with eyes that held too much knowledge. Without speaking, the old woman examined Milka's muddy shoes, her pale face, the way her hands shook as she set down the water vessels. Then she nodded once, grimly, and began preparing a protective charm that would hang above Milka's bed for the rest of her childhood. The drowned ones remember being children, grandmother explained that evening as she worked dried herbs into small cloth pouches. They remember play and laughter and the dreams we have before the world teaches us its hardness. But they have forgotten the warmth of breath in their lungs, the beat of blood in their veins, the simple joy of waking each morning to find yourself still alive. Milka watched the old woman's skilled hands create protections that would guard against water spirits, charms that had kept generations of children safe from the beautiful songs that promised everything and delivered only cold death beneath the waves. They are not evil, grandmother continued. They are lonely. They want playmates in their underwater realm. They want sisters and brothers to ease the eternal aching of being caught between life and death. But their need does not make them safe. Their sadness does not make their promises true. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the roof with a sound like fingers tapping against wood, like voices calling from beyond the village boundaries, where darker things waited for children who forgot that survival meant saying no to even the most beautiful invitations. But the water spirits were not the only ones who watched children with hungry eyes. Closer to home, in the very walls and corners of the houses where families believed themselves safe, other beings stirred with needs and appetites that could turn protective love into smothering possession. The domovoi had been with Mikhail's family longer than anyone could remember, perhaps longer than the house itself had stood. Some said the household spirit had followed them from their old home when Mikhail's great-grandfather moved to the village. Others claimed he had always lived in the spot where the house was built, had watched the trees fall and the foundation stones laid and the walls rise around his ancient resting place. Most of the time, the family barely noticed his presence. Milk stayed fresh longer than it should. Bread rose higher and more evenly than seemed natural. Small objects that went missing, needles, coins, favorite toys, reappeared in helpful places just when they were needed most. The fire never quite died during cold nights, even when the wood supply seemed too low to last until morning. These were signs of a contented domovoi, a household spirit who felt properly appreciated and welcomed. Mikhail's grandmother left out small offerings each night, a piece of bread, a cup of milk, sometimes a bit of honey or a small cake. She thanked the domovoi aloud when good fortune came to the family, and she made sure every member of the household understood the importance of maintaining the spirit's goodwill. But household spirits, like all powerful beings, required careful handling. They could be petty, jealous, and quick to take offense. A domovoi who felt ignored or disrespected could make family life a misery of small disasters. Sour milk, burned bread, lost possessions, minor injuries that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. Mikhail learned this lesson when he was 9 years old and still young enough to believe that rules existed mainly to restrict his fun rather than protect his life. It started with something small. Mikhail had been playing with wooden carved animals, a gift from his uncle who traveled to distant markets, when one of the figures, a small horse, rolled under the large wooden chest where his grandmother kept the family's winter bedding. Without thinking, without asking permission, Mikhail crawled under the chest to retrieve his toy. The space beneath the chest was where his grandmother left the domovoi's nightly offerings. It was a sacred space, a tiny shrine dedicated to the being who protected their home. And there, in a small wooden bowl worn smooth by years of use, were the remnants of that morning's offering: breadcrumbs, a few drops of milk, and a single wildflower picked from the garden. Mikhail should have backed away immediately, should have apologized aloud to any listening spirits, and left the space undisturbed, should have remembered that some places in the house were not meant for children's games. Instead, curious about the small objects he found in the shadow beneath the chest, he reached out and touched the flower. The moment his finger brushed the wilted petals, the temperature in the house dropped. Not gradually, not naturally, but instantly and noticeably, as if winter had suddenly reclaimed the summer afternoon. The flower crumbled to dust at his touch, and the milk in the offering bowl began to sour, developing the thick, unpleasant smell of spoiled dairy. Mikhail scrambled out from under the chest, his heart racing with the sudden certainty that he had done something terribly wrong. The house felt different now, watchful, angry, charged with the kind of tension that comes before thunderstorms. Shadows seemed deeper and more animate. The floorboards creaked without anyone walking on them. Somewhere in the walls, something scratched and rustled with frustrated, irritated energy. That night, things began to go wrong. First, the evening meal burned despite Mikhail's mother's careful attention to the cooking fire. The bread that had been rising beautifully all day collapsed into a flat, inedible mass. The milk they had drawn fresh that morning developed a bitter taste that made the younger children gag and refuse to drink it. Then the small accidents started. Mikhail stubbed his toe on furniture that had never been a problem before. His sister cut her finger on a knife that seemed to slip from her grasp without warning. His baby brother, normally a peaceful sleeper, woke screaming from nightmares he was too young to explain. The family's cat, a clever mouser who usually kept the house free of vermin, cowered in corners and refused to hunt. Mice appeared in the grain stores despite the cat's presence. Important household items, cooking spoons, sewing needles, the iron key to the root cellar, vanished and remained lost despite desperate searching. By the third day, Mikhail's grandmother knew what had happened, even though no one had told her about the disturbed offering. She recognized the signs of a displeased domovoi, the accumulation of small misfortunes, the sense of unease that permeated the house, the way normal objects seemed to develop malicious intentions. "Someone has offended our protector," she announced at the evening meal, her stern gaze finding each family member in turn. "Someone has shown disrespect to the one who keeps our home safe." Mikhail's face burned with shame and fear. He knew he should confess, should admit his mistake and ask for guidance in making amends. But he was 9 years old and terrified of punishment, both from his family and from the invisible being whose anger had turned their peaceful home into a place of constant worry. So he said nothing, and the misfortunes continued. The next morning, Mikhail woke to find all his carved animals scattered across the floor of his sleeping area, arranged in a perfect circle with their faces pointing inward toward an empty space. In the center of the circle, written in what looked like soot from the fireplace, was a single word in the old script that grandmother sometimes used for protective charms. Mikhail couldn't read the old writing, but he understood the message anyway. The domovoi was calling him out, marking him as the source of the household's troubles. The spirit knew exactly who had disturbed the sacred offering, and his patience was running out. That afternoon, when the latest small disaster, a pot of precious honey that somehow spilled across the kitchen floor, brought his mother to tears of frustration, Mikhail finally found the courage to confess. His grandmother listened to his stammered explanation without interruption, her weathered face growing more serious with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his transgression, but the proper response to repair the damage. "You have learned something important today," she said finally. "You have learned that respect is not just politeness, it is survival. The beings who share our world are not pets or playthings. They are ancient powers with their own needs and their own justice." That evening, grandmother prepared a special offering: fresh bread baked with honey, milk still warm from the cow, flowers picked from the most carefully tended part of the garden. But the offering was not enough by itself. Mikhail had to make personal amends for his disrespect. Under his grandmother's careful instruction, he crawled back under the wooden chest, though every instinct screamed at him to stay away from that charged, dangerous space. With his own hands, he placed the offering in the little wooden bowl. In his own voice, shaking with fear but clear enough to be understood, he spoke the words of apology grandmother had taught him. "Grandfather of the house, protector of our family, I ask your forgiveness for my thoughtless action. I am young and foolish, but I mean no disrespect. Please accept this offering and continue to watch over those I love." The response was immediate. The oppressive feeling that had weighed on the house for days lifted like mist before sunrise. The temperature returned to normal. The scratching and rustling in the walls ceased. Even the family cat emerged from hiding and began washing itself with the confident precision of an animal that felt safe again. But grandmother was not finished with Mikhail's education. That night, as the family settled around the fire, she told him about other children who had offended household spirits and faced consequences far worse than a few days of minor disasters. In the next village, she said, her voice dropping to the whisper she used for the most serious teachings, there was a boy who thought the domovoy's offerings were food left out for him. He ate the bread and drank the milk meant for the protector of his home. That night, he woke to find his hair being braided while he slept, braided so tightly it cut off the blood to his scalp. His family had to cut his hair to the roots to free him, and for the rest of his life, his hair grew white where the spirit's fingers had touched it. Mikhail shivered and touched his own dark hair, imagining phantom fingers weaving punishment into his scalp while he slept. In another village, grandmother continued, a girl decided to clean the space where the domovoi rested, thinking she was being helpful. She swept away offerings that had been accumulating for generations, scrubbed the walls clean of soot and dust that held decades of protective power. The spirit left that house the same night, and within a year, 3 children in the family had died of diseases that proper protection would have prevented us. The stories went on, each one illustrating the same fundamental truth. The beings who shared human space were not human. They had their own logic, their own needs, their own definitions of respect and insult. They could be generous protectors or terrible enemies, and the difference often came down to how well humans understood and honored the invisible boundaries that kept both worlds in balance. From that night forward, Mikhail never forgot to acknowledge the domovoi when he entered or left the house. He learned to recognize the signs of the spirit's presence, the way dust motes danced in certain corners, the subtle warmth that gathered near the offering space, the feeling of being watched by benevolent eyes during the darkest hours of night. And he learned that protection came with responsibility. The beings who kept children safe expected respect, attention, and the kind of careful observance that turned daily life into a series of small rituals designed to maintain harmony between worlds that touched but never quite merged. But of all the spirits that haunted the edges of human settlement, none inspired more terror in children's hearts than the witch who lived where the forest grew thickest and wildest, where paths ended and reason failed, and the very trees seemed to bend away from something too strange for the natural world to embrace. Baba Yaga had been old when the world was young. She had seen empires rise and fall like waves against rocky shores. She had watched forests burn and regrow, rivers change their courses, mountains crumble into valleys. Through all the long centuries of change and chaos, she remained constant, ancient, powerful, and utterly unpredictable in her dealings with the mortals who occasionally stumbled into her domain. Her hut stood in the deepest part of the forest, balanced on enormous chicken legs that could carry it to new locations when the mood struck her. The fence around her garden was built from human bones, topped with skulls that glowed with cold fire during the darkest hours of night. Her mortar and pestle, large enough to carry her through the sky, were carved from stone so old it remembered the world's first rains. She was death and wisdom, terror and transformation, the final test that separated children who would grow into wise adults from those who would never grow at all. Young Pavel met her on a morning when hunger had driven his family to desperation. The winter had been harsh and long, spring was late in coming, and the stored food that should have lasted until the first harvest was nearly gone. Pavel's mother had fallen ill with the wasting sickness that claimed so many during the hard months, and his father spent long days in the forest trying to hunt game that had grown scarce and wary. That left Pavel, barely 12 years old, to care for his younger siblings and search for anything edible that might keep the family alive until better times returned. His grandmother had told him stories about the witch's garden, about the magical fruits and vegetables that grew there in abundance, regardless of season or weather. She had also told him that seeking help from Baba Yaga was like grasping a blade by its edge, possible but likely to result in more harm than help. But desperation makes people brave in ways wisdom never does. When Pavel's baby sister began crying from hunger and there was nothing left to feed her except water and hope, he made the choice that would either save his family or end his own story in ways too terrible to imagine. He walked deeper into the forest than he had ever gone before, following deer paths that became fainter and stranger the farther he traveled. The trees grew larger and more twisted, their branches forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air smelled of things that had no names in human language, ancient decay and impossible flowers, smoke from fires that burned without fuel, the metallic scent of magic so old it had worn grooves in reality itself. When he finally saw the hut, balanced impossibly on its massive chicken legs, scratching at the ground like a bird searching for worms, Pavel's first instinct was to run. Everything about the structure spoke of power that operated by rules completely different from anything he understood. The fence of bones moved slightly in windless air, and the skull lamps tracked his approach with hollow sockets that held pinpricks of cold light. But his sister's hungry cries echoed in his memory, giving him courage to approach the gate in the bone fence and speak the words his grandmother had taught him for emergencies too desperate for common sense. Baba Yaga, iron teeth, grandmother who knows all secrets, I come seeking help for my family. I offer fair trade for fair assistance. The hut's chicken legs stopped scratching. The door, painted with symbols that seemed to shift and change when Pavel wasn't looking directly at them, swung open with a creak like breaking bones. And from the dark interior came a voice like grinding millstones, like wind through autumn graveyards, like the last words of dying things. So, little boy child comes to trade with Baba Yaga. What does he offer? What does he seek? And does he know the price of dealing with death's grandmother? Pavel stepped through the bone gate, which closed behind him with a sound like breaking teeth. He climbed the steps to the hut's door, each footfall echoing with unnatural resonance. And he entered the dwelling of the most dangerous being in all the forest, carrying nothing but his courage and the hope that his grandmother's stories had taught him enough to survive what was coming. The interior of the hut was larger than the exterior should have allowed, not just bigger, but impossibly vast, with rooms that stretched beyond what normal architecture could contain. The walls were lined with strange objects, mirrors that reflected other worlds, jars filled with swirling mists that might have been captured dreams or bottled sorrows, shelves upon shelves of bottles and boxes and bundles whose contents were best left unexamined. Baba Yaga herself sat in a chair carved from a single enormous bone, spinning thread from material that gleamed like starlight and felt like captured moonbeams. She was exactly as the stories described, and completely unlike them, ancient beyond measure, but vital with terrible energy, ugly as sin, but compelling as truth, small as a bent crone, but vast as the spaces between stars. Her iron teeth glinted when she smiled, and her eyes held depths that had watched the world's secrets unfold since time began. Hungry children, she said, though Pavel had not yet explained his need. Empty bellies and the empty hands, mother sick, father hunting shadows, baby crying for milk that does not exist. Yes, grandmother knows why you have come. Pavel's throat felt dry as dust, but he managed to speak. My family is starving. I seek food to keep them alive until spring brings new growth. Food, Baba Yaga repeated, tasting the word like wine. Simple request, but nothing is simple in grandmother's domain. Food for the hungry, yes, but what payment does little boy child offer? What service will he perform? What price will he pay for life-saving magic? This was the moment Pavel's grandmother had warned him about, the moment when Baba Yaga would name her price, and he would have to decide whether survival was worth whatever she demanded. Some children never returned from such bargains. Others came back changed in ways that made their families weep. But some, a fortunate few, managed to navigate the witch's tests and win not just what they sought, but wisdom that would serve them for the rest of their lives. I offer fair work for fair payment, Pavel said, using the formula his grandmother had taught him. I will complete whatever task you set, if it is within a mortal child's power to accomplish. Baba Yaga's laugh was like winter wind through empty trees. Clever words, little boy child. Grandmother likes clever children. They make the best servants and the most interesting meals. She rose from her bone chair and moved about the hut with quick, jerky motions that reminded Pavel of a spider checking its web. When she turned back to him, her expression had shifted to something that might have been approval or might have been hunger. With Baba Yaga, the two were often identical. 3 tasks, she announced. Complete them before sunset, and grandmother will give you food enough to feed your family through the hungry time. Fail, and you become ingredient in grandmother's soup. Refuse, and you walk home with nothing but the knowledge that your pride was worth more than your sister's life. Pavel nodded, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. 3 tasks, before sunset, with his family's survival and his own life hanging in the balance. The first task seemed simple enough. Clean the hut from top to bottom, sweeping out all dust and dirt until every surface gleamed. But as Pavel began to work, he quickly discovered that this was no ordinary cleaning. Every speck of dust he swept up was immediately replaced by more dust that seemed to fall from empty air. Every surface he cleaned became dirty again the moment he moved to the next area. The harder he worked, the more work appeared, as if the hut itself was fighting against his efforts. By noon, Pavel was exhausted and no closer to completing the task than when he had started. Sweat poured down his face, his arms ached from constant sweeping, and despair began to creep into his heart like cold fingers. But then he remembered something his grandmother had told him about dealing with magic that seemed impossible. Sometimes the solution lay not in working harder, but in working smarter. Instead of trying to clean the entire hut at once, Pavel focused on a single small area, just the space around Baba Yaga's bone chair. He swept carefully and thoroughly, paying attention to every corner and crevice. Then, instead of moving on to another area, he sat down in the cleaned space and waited. Slowly, gradually, the rest of the hut began to clean itself. Dust swirled up from the floors and out through the windows. Cobwebs dissolved like morning mist. Surfaces gleamed without his touch, as if the hut had been waiting for him to demonstrate proper respect for the task before allowing it to be completed. The second task was to sort a mountain of mixed grain, wheat, barley, rye, and oats all jumbled together, separating each type into its own pile before the sun reached its highest point. The mountain was enormous, easily the work of several days for human hands, but Pavel had listened carefully to his grandmother's stories about Baba Yaga's tests, and he knew that brute force was rarely the answer. Instead of beginning to sort the grain himself, Pavel spoke politely to the small creatures he could see watching from the corners of the hut, mice and birds and insects that lived in the spaces between the witch's world and the natural forest. "Friends," he said, "I need help with this task, and I know you are skilled at handling grain. If you assist me, I will ensure that Baba Yaga's garden always has seeds scattered for your winter feeding." The creatures exchanged glances that held more intelligence than animals should possess. Then, moving with purpose and coordination that spoke of long practice with the witch's strange tests, they began to sort the grain. Mice carried individual seeds to appropriate piles. Birds used their beaks to separate different types, and insects worked with tiny precision to ensure no grain was placed incorrectly. Within an hour, the task was complete, not through Pavel's labor, but through his understanding that cooperation often succeeded where individual effort failed. The third task was the most dangerous. Pavel had to retrieve a specific bottle from Baba Yaga's collection, a bottle filled with swirling golden mist that the witch claimed contained the essence of satisfied hunger. But the bottle was located on the highest shelf in a room where every surface was covered with similar containers, many of which held things far too dangerous for mortal hands to touch. Pavel approached the storage room carefully, studying the hundreds of bottles and jars that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Some contained swirling mists, like the one he sought. Others held what looked like liquid starlight, crystallized screams, or moving shadows that pressed against their glass prisons with evident malevolence. But his grandmother had taught him that Baba Yaga's tests always contained their own solutions, if you knew how to look for them. Pavel closed his eyes and tried to sense rather than see what he needed to find. He thought about hunger, his own, his family's, the gnawing emptiness that had driven him to this desperate gamble. When he opened his eyes, one bottle among all the others seemed to pulse with warm, golden light. Not the brightest bottle, not the most beautiful, but the one that resonated with the very need that had brought him here. Pavel climbed carefully up the shelves, avoiding containers that whispered warnings or leaked strange vapors, until he could reach the bottle that called to him. The moment his fingers closed around its surface, he felt warmth spread through his entire body. Not just physical warmth, but the deep satisfaction that comes from a good meal shared with loved ones, the contentment of a full belly and a grateful heart. As the sun touched the horizon, Pavel stood before Baba Yaga with all three tasks completed. The witch examined his work with eyes that missed nothing, testing the cleaned surfaces for dust, checking the sorted grain for errors, examining the bottle he had retrieved to ensure it was exactly what she had requested. Finally, she nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and a certain respect for his cleverness. "Well done, little boy-child," she said, her iron teeth glinting in the fading light. "You have shown wisdom beyond your years, cooperation with those different from yourself, and the ability to trust intuition over fear. These are rare qualities in any mortal, rarer still in children who face desperate circumstances." From her vast stores, Baba Yaga gathered payment for Pavel's successful completion of her tests. Bread that would never grow stale, preserved meats that would multiply when shared generously, seeds that would grow in any soil regardless of season, and medicines that would cure his mother's illness and prevent its return. But the greatest gift was the knowledge she shared as she prepared his payment. "Remember, little boy-child," she said, "that surviving the forest requires more than following rules. It requires understanding that rules exist to teach wisdom, not to limit possibility. You succeeded today, not because you followed instructions exactly, but because you understood the spirit behind the instructions and adapted them to impossible circumstances. Pavel carried her gifts home through the darkening forest, guided by lights that danced just ahead of his footsteps, spirits of the forest showing him safe passage in recognition of his successful completion of the witch's trials. His family survived the hungry time, his mother recovered her health, and Pavel grew into a man known throughout the region for his wisdom and his ability to find solutions to problems that defeated others. But he never forgot the lessons learned in Baba Yaga's hut, that the most dangerous tests often contained their own solutions, that cooperation could accomplish what individual effort could not, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting against impossible odds, but in understanding them well enough to transform them into opportunities. The forest spirits taught their lessons through different methods, but the underlying wisdom remained constant across all encounters. Survival in a world where the supernatural was natural required more than memorizing rules or carrying protective charms. It required developing an intuitive understanding of the forces that shaped reality, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed which spirits were present and what they wanted, and above all, maintaining the delicate balance between respect and self-protection that kept children alive long enough to become adults. Those who survived long enough to have children of their own became the next generation of teachers, passing down hard-won knowledge through stories told by firelight and protective rituals woven into daily life. They taught their children to recognize the signs of spirit activity, the way shadows moved differently when unseen watchers were present, the quality of silence that indicated predatory attention, the feeling of being observed by eyes that belonged to no visible creature. They shared the practical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death, which plants offered protection and which invited danger, how to move through the forest without attracting unwanted attention, what offerings would appease angry spirits, and what actions would escalate supernatural conflicts into deadly confrontations. Most importantly, they taught their children to understand that the world was far larger and stranger than human experience could encompass. The spirits of forest and water, household and field were not aberrations or intrusions into the natural order. They were part of that order, ancient inhabitants of a world that humans shared but did not own. This understanding shaped the way children moved through their daily lives, adding layers of awareness and caution to activities that might seem simple to modern eyes. Gathering food in the forest became an exercise in negotiation with unseen powers. Drawing water from streams required protective rituals and careful attention to signs that might indicate spiritual presence. Even sleeping safely in one's own bed depended on maintaining proper relationships with the household spirits who could provide protection or withdraw it based on how well they felt respected and appreciated. The children who learned these lessons well grew into adults who could navigate the complex relationships between human and spirit worlds with confidence and skill. They became village-wise women and cunning men, healers who understood that illness could have supernatural as well as natural causes, leaders who could negotiate with forces beyond normal human authority. But the children who failed to learn, who ignored the old wisdom or forgot the protective traditions, often simply vanished. Their stories became cautionary tales told to the next generation, examples of what happened when respect turned to carelessness, when curiosity overcame prudence, when children convinced themselves that the old fears were just superstition and the old protections were no longer necessary. Some vanished quietly, slipping away from human memory as if they had never existed. Others disappeared dramatically, leaving behind only traces that spoke of encounters with beings far more powerful than mortal children could hope to survive. All became part of the teaching stories, their fates serving as vivid reminders of why the old ways persisted through generations of change and challenge. The forest remembered them all, the wise and the foolish, the protected and the lost, the children who grew up to teach others, and the children who fed the hungry dark with their innocence and blood. In the spaces between the trees, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy and shadows held deeper mysteries than any human mind could fathom, their echoes lingered. Sometimes, when the wind was right and the moon was dark and the boundary between worlds grew thin, you could almost hear them. Whispers in languages that predated human speech, laughter that belonged to children who would never grow old, warnings spoken by voices that had forgotten how to be afraid because they had already learned the ultimate lesson about what lay beyond fear. And in the villages where their descendants still lived, where their stories were still told, and their protections still practiced, children continued to learn the ancient art of survival in a world where being human was just one option among many, where safety was temporary and wisdom was the only reliable protection against forces that could not be fought, only respected, avoided, or occasionally, if you were very clever and very lucky, successfully negotiated with. The old knowledge survived because it had to, because somewhere in the deep woods, ancient things still stirred with purposes that had nothing to do with human welfare, because streams still held voices that sang of drowning, and houses still sheltered spirits whose protection came with prices that had to be paid in daily recognition and nightly offerings, because children still disappeared when they forgot that they were small things in a vast world, and parents still woke to find empty beds and no trace of where their little ones had gone, except perhaps a single footprint at the forest's edge or a piece of torn clothing caught on thorns that grew where no thorns had been the day before. And because, in the end, the only thing standing between those children and the hungry darkness was the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned through trial and terrible error how to walk safely through a world where magic was real and not all magic was friendly to human dreams. So the stories continued, passed from grandmother to grandchild, from wise woman to young mother, from survivor to the next generation who would face the same ancient tests with only words and warnings to guide them through the spaces where daylight faltered and night held older claims than any human settlement could hope to challenge. The forest spirits waited, patient as stone, old as rivers, hungry as winter, ready to teach their lessons to any child brave enough or foolish enough to venture beyond the safety of smoke and firelight into the realm where human rules had never applied and human safety had never been guaranteed. But some children learned, some children survived, some children grew up to pass on the old wisdom to new generations who would face the same eternal choice between respect and recklessness, between careful steps and careless wandering, between the safety of knowledge and the danger of forgetting that in the deep woods, where the old powers still held sway, every breath was a gift, and every dawn was a victory earned through wisdom older than memory itself.